Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Pandemic Academy at the Evergreen State College. You are listening to Tosca Olson. I'm a faculty member at Evergreen in Sociology. In this presentation, we're going to be looking at the concepts of fear and resilience from a sociological lens. We'll start with some brief introductions, and then we'll look at a sociological perspective on fear and apply it in depth to the COVID-19 pandemic. We can also develop a more complex understanding of resilience when we consider that individuals flourish within social contexts and that resilience is a shared endeavor. So we're going to be looking at that as well. Let's start by thinking a little bit about what we mean by fear. So think to yourself, and you can write this or you can just think in your mind, what does fear feel like to you? And how fearful are you these days? And what explains your current level of fear? These are questions that we might look at as we're trying to understand fear. So, for example, do you think that fear is just a biochemical response, an instinctive response? Or maybe it's something that you've learned. You've learned from cultural norms and socialization and past experiences. Well, it's actually kind of both. It's both an instinctive and a learned response. And it can be expressed differently across cultures. The focus of what we're going to do today is look mostly at this last question, which is what explains your levels of fear? So let's talk a little bit before you get too far into things about who you're listening to. I figured I should introduce myself just because you're going to be listening to my voice for quite some time. So I've been at Evergreen for over 20 years. You're looking at some of the titles of the programs that I've taught over this time. I've taught in a wide variety of programs that integrate a bunch of different disciplines around important issues and questions like how do we understand crime and respond to it, and how do we understand healing and identity, how do we use power and how do we resist power. But as a sociologist, one feature of my contributions to these programs, regardless of whether I'm teaching with a biologist or a chemist or historian, anthropologist or mathematician, is the perspective that looks at how forces beyond the individual affect our experiences as individuals. Even those experiences that can feel very personal, I will argue, are influenced by forces that are beyond us as individuals. And that's what the sociological perspective is. It asserts that individuals' attitudes, behaviors, and experiences are shaped by social forces, such as their social networks, cultural identities, and the economic and political systems in which they live. So a famous sociologist, C. Wright Mills, when he was talking about the sociological imagination, he said that personal troubles are rooted in public issues. Personal troubles are rooted in public issues. And we can apply that idea to the COVID-19 pandemic and to our experiences of being in a pandemic. So we've already done that a little bit from, or actually Carolyn Prouty did an awesome job talking about the social determinants of health in an earlier Pandemic Academy lecture. And we can apply these ideas of the sociological perspective as we understand emotions and health and illness, because these things are aspects of social circumstances. Social circumstances influence who experiences health and who experiences illness, who experiences fear in some cases, and also our definitions of these things, health and illness and fear. So the question that we're going to be looking at is, how can we apply the sociological perspective to the current pandemic? So the guiding question for our presentation is, how do social forces influence our experiences and perceptions of the COVID-19 pandemic? And I'm going to be arguing that our individual experiences of fear and resilience are shaped by culture, history, and social context. I'll be introducing a sociological model of fear, and we'll break down those elements and apply them. And then also we'll look at multidimensional models of resilience and consider their implications as well. So here is the model of fear that we're going to be looking at a little bit. In a macro sociology of fear, Tudor argues that the intensity, duration, and character of our fear experiences are the outcome of a lot of different interacting variables, not just the biological response. They're the outcome of macro level environments, cultures, and social structures that shape our choices, opportunities, values, and beliefs, and also more micro level variables that impact our individual actions and agency. So have a look at this model. We're going to be breaking it down a little bit. You can still see it a little bit. Here are some examples of elements of this model. And as we review these aspects, consider how they might explain some of the fear that some of us are currently experiencing in the COVID-19 pandemic. So when Tudor talks about the physical and built environment, he's writing about things like whether or not there are lions and tigers around, whether or not there are big storms, what the perceptions of risk and crime risk are in a city, the perceived levels of threats due to human-led environmental degradation, global transportation that can facilitate the spread of viruses. All of these things are part of the environment that structures our fear. Another element is cultural environments. These are the reservoirs of values, stereotypes, beliefs, memories, meanings on which we try to draw from to make sense of our daily experiences. So for example, if our cultures warn us that certain situations or activities are dangerous, then fearfulness may grow. Social structures are the stable arrangements of institutions in which we interact, and also the relationships among people that they create. So the way that social roles and networks of relationships are arranged among institutions like the economy, the political system, education, family, healthcare, media, all of those things, those arrangements influence our behavior and also create hierarchies of status that may create the potential for fear in some people and not others. So the first three elements are the structuring environments of fear. And then within these environments, our bodies are socially constructed in particular ways and instilled with particular meanings. For example, in this way, a tall, muscular, white young man in good health may be less fearful in some situations than would a person with another gender, race, ethnicity, age, or physicality. In terms of what Tudor calls personalities, I would say that each of us as individuals brings psychological traits and states that we've developed due to previous experiences, and that these interact with the social and cultural and physical environments of fear to impact our individual experiences of fear and agency. And also as humans, we have certain cognitive biases or habits of mind that can increase the potential to feel fear in some situations. And we'll be talking a little bit about those. And in terms of being social subjects, we are all enmeshed within webs of social interactions and routines that impact our potential fearfulness. So for example, parents or family members caring for elders may perceive different dangers in the coronavirus outbreak than do adolescents, simply by virtue of where they are in their life cycle. So we're individual agents, and we operate in these structuring factors within this environment. And as agents, the individual factors of bodies and psychology and social characteristics impact the experience of fear that we have, and also particular ways that we relate to our environment. So we're going to wonder now, I'm wondering, how can this model help us understand fear in the current pandemic? And we're going to be looking at some of these structuring factors and looking at some research on how they relate and operate in the United States. To begin with, I think we do need to acknowledge that yes, pandemics can produce very scary environments. It can be a scary thing to be in a place and during a time when an epidemic is happening, because viruses can be transmitted rapidly. You can't see them. It's accounted for a lot of sickness and death in previous epidemics or pandemics. There's a lot of evolution, or the potential of evolution of the virus. Often the media and government officials and people that you hang out with are in awe of what's happening, because we can be victims and also we can spread the outbreak. That's a scary thing. And because there is the potential that officials may infringe on personal rights in order to control the outbreak. All of these things are potentially scary things in our environment during a pandemic, and can create something that Pappas argues is called germ panic, where there's a degree of fear in the environment that's disproportionate to the actual risks that are brought by the virus itself. And we're going to explore some of these factors further. We're going to be looking a little bit at culture as well. In case you are wondering what culture is, here's a nice iceberg that shows you what culture is. This is from Edward Hall's cultural iceberg model. And a lot of people who write about fear and the culture of fear say that culture contextualizes our responses to and also our experiences of pandemics and other crises. So if you wanted to define culture, you could think about culture as shared systems of beliefs, values, meanings, and behavior. We can see some things that are related to culture. That's called surface culture, things like games and language, food and festivals. But the vast majority of our culture is unconscious and concerns factors like attitudes towards elders and towards death, approaches to problem solving, notions of cleanliness, how we handle and display emotion, concepts of self and roles and justice. So you can be in many different groups that share systems of belief and values and meaning, and cultural groups can be based on nationality or race, ethnicity, gender, religion, even occupation. So you can be a member of many different cultural groups. You may have read one of the articles that I ask people to read, which is from Frank Ferretti, called The Changing Meaning of Disaster. He's a somewhat controversial sociologist. He's written quite a bit about fear and the culture of fear. One thing that he asserts is that our fearfulness is not solely based by the threats we face. He says that things like our sentiments about the unknown, uncertainty, the future, critical events, these are all features of our cultural landscape and have varied across time. So for example, in the Middle Ages, solar eclipses and comets were seen as catastrophes because they were viewed as signs of God's anger against human sins. And despite 4,000 or more deaths due to a major smog in 1952 in London, the event was understood more as a necessary evil of industrialization rather than a sign that the world was becoming more dangerous. But when Ferretti looks at contemporary society, especially the United States and UK. He argues that our culture transmits the view that we live in a very dangerous and hazardous time. So Fioretti writes, how we view adversity and pain have important implications on how society engages with the threats that it faces. Ideas about how people are likely to cope in an emergency or a disaster are shaped by prior experience, but also by a cultural narrative that provides a frame through which people understand and make sense of their experience. Western culture frequently transmits the view that we live in a uniquely dangerous era where humanity faces hazards and potential disaster. Another potential reading that you might have done was Horowitz's article on the overview of sociological perspectives on the definitions, causes, and responses to mental health and illness. And Horowitz wrote that cultural values that promote cohesion, meaning, and mutual aid tend to support mental health, but cultures that create expectations that their members can't fulfill, like achieving material success, can lead to great distress. So those are other examples of how culture might influence people's emotions, people's interpretations. So just pause for a moment to think, does this ring true for you? Why or why not? Do you think that we have a disaster consciousness? I'll give you a second to just think about these questions that are on the screen right now. And these questions are, do our cultures promote a generalized climate of fear, leading us to be frightened without a specific cause? Are we taught to view people and adversity through a lens of vulnerability or through a lens of capability? Do our cultures promote cohesion, meaning, and mutual aid? And more importantly, most importantly, what are the implications of these questions for the COVID-19 pandemic? For example, are we primed for greater fearfulness? Just take a moment and think about that. All right. I hope you enjoyed that piano piece. That was an original piece by an Evergreen student named Gabe. Awesome job, Gabe. All right. So you've thought a little bit about culture and fear, and maybe a culture of fear. You have some ideas that you can share with your classmates, families, friends, neighbors, once you finish thinking about this idea of the structuring elements of fear. Next, we're going to continue by looking at some more social structural elements of fear. And we're going to examine that by looking at the ideas of social structures and bodies and how these things interact to produce fear. Another one of the articles that you might have read in preparation for today is from Baker and colleagues called Social Inequality, Medical Fears and Pandemics. And what this research does is it reviews several years of the Chapman Survey of American Fear, which is an annual random nationally representative survey of over 1,000 people about what they fear. And just as a snapshot conclusion, Baker and colleagues conclude that fear is greater for those who are in precarious social positions, which is something that you might have expected given Carolyn Prouty's presentation earlier. So Baker and colleagues conclude that women, people of color, and those with less income and education had higher levels of fear across many of the dimensions that they collected data on. We'll look at a couple of the tables because sociologists like data. So here is one of the tables that comes from the article that from Baker and colleagues. And what you see are different dimensions of fearing along the bottom. Fearing that people I love are going to die, people I love are going to get sick, people I love are going to, or that I personally are going to become ill, or I'm afraid of the pandemic. And what this table shows is that for each type of health fear, people of color reported that they were very afraid at much higher rates, at much higher percentages than did people who were white. And the authors conclude that the privileged can afford to not be preoccupied with health and medical concerns. Another table from this article looks at how health fears vary by income level. And again, they use the same for different types of health fear. And for each type of health fear, they found that people with less income report greater fear. And they conclude that the social determinants of health, disparities in healthcare, and an inability to afford staying home from work all contribute to disparities in fear. The authors also created what they called a global fear metric called the sum of all fears. And they did this to examine how fear overall is related to things like satisfaction with life and quality of life. And you'll see that higher levels of fear are strongly connected to steep declines in social, personal, and financial well-being. These data were all collected before the pandemic, but we're lucky that we have large-scale surveys going on all the time, and as sociologists, we can always find data that's current. So I wanted to show you a little bit of the data that's related to fear and fear of the current outbreak. And we can do that by looking at the Pew Charitable Trust's research. They're regularly collecting data in advance of the election. And so they were already doing that. So they decided to add some questions in their surveys on COVID-19 fear. So again, they're using random nationally representative samples. And they have a great data tool that you can use that's referenced here, or you can just Google Pew Research Center. And you can play with the data yourself. You can filter fear, different kinds of fear or different concerns by gender, race, age, political party, education. It's really an interesting thing to do. So I'll just show you a couple of the results from the past couple of months. These are 3 different snapshots of a question that is how nervous or anxious or on edge have you felt over the past 7 days? And the data that I picked were information on gender, political party, and age. And what the results are at this point are that women and Democrats were much more likely than men or Republicans to report that they'd felt nervous, anxious, or on edge most of the time for 5 to 7 days in the past week. Also, interestingly, young people were more likely to report consistent nervousness than older people. But if you look a little bit deeper at that, it's for different reasons. The younger people were concerned about finances, and the elders were concerned about potential health effects. So the Pew folks can break that up a little bit. Another type of bit of data that they collected was on how concerned people are that they will get the coronavirus and require hospitalization. The data that you're seeing here is how responses vary by income and also race. And what you find is that, what they have found is that people with less income are more likely than people with more income to be very concerned that they're going to get the coronavirus and require hospitalization. And also that Black people who are not Hispanic and Hispanic people were much more likely to be very concerned that they'll get the coronavirus and require hospitalization than were non-Hispanic whites. So the point of all this data so far is that social structures and socially constructed bodies can help explain variations in fear of COVID-19. Both the level of fear and also the type of perceived threat varies by income, race, ethnicity, age, gender, and political party. And if you look more deeply at the types of perceived threats that people are perceiving, there are also variations in terms of personal health, whether people are afraid that they're unknowingly going to spread the virus to others, how threatening the pandemic is to the day-to-day life in their communities, how threatening it is to their personal financial situation and to the health of the entire US population. So positionality then is pretty important in explaining why people fear and how much they fear and what they fear. And so another question for you to think about as you're pondering this presentation and life in general is, how do you think your positionality has affected your fearfulness during this pandemic? How do you think your positionality has affected your fearfulness during this pandemic? As we continue thinking about this model, the sociological model of fear, we're going to be transitioning now to some more psychological level explanations of fear. And it's true that the social and cognitive psychology of uncertain situations can make us more susceptible to fear, and also to the messages that media covers, the framing that media offers of the current situation. So let's look a little bit at some of these issues. As we looked at in terms of the environment, there is currently limited knowledge, limited objective knowledge, because it's a new and evolving situation. And uncertainty and a perception of a lack of control can increase anxiety. This is something that has been researched from previous epidemics. When you're uncertain and you perceive a lack of control, people generally want to seek information to try and really reduce the uncertainty, even if that information is wrong, which can be problematic in the current media climate. We also like simple solutions, which can be problematic when we like simple solutions when we are uncertain and afraid. So this is especially a problem because of certain habits of the mind, certain cognitive biases, like we're more likely to give weight to events that we can immediately recall. We tend to believe things that we read repeatedly. We look for information that validates our beliefs, and we remember things that elicit strong emotions. So just think for a second about how media, social media, news media tend to cover events, how they've been covering events in the pandemic, and think, what are people who are going to be watching the media a lot going to be seeing repeatedly? Are they eliciting strong emotions? And what are the potential problematics of that? Another issue that we need to consider is that we are social creatures and we take cues from each other. So when the news or social media or just our friends and our families, when we're constantly discussing hoarding, for example, it becomes normalized, and then it further spreads that idea that hoarding is normal and necessary in this situation. Whereas if we constantly talked about the idea that we don't need to hoard and that supplies will be there, then that might be something that was normalized in our discourses. So all of these factors can lead to hypervigilance, fear, panic, xenophobia, as we try to find somebody to blame. It's true that pandemics have real effects and they require action to manage. We need to wash our hands. We need to distance ourselves and wear masks. Precaution is healthy, but panic is unhealthy. So this is time for you to ask yourself again. And this is something that you can do periodically when you are maybe feeling a little out of sorts or concerned. Ask yourself, what is the real danger versus what is the perceived danger? Is there something that you're perceiving that's not really there? How can you get accurate information and avoid misinformation and also stay connected to people that you love without overdoing media exposure? And very importantly, given uncertain times and the way that people tend to react during uncertain times, what can you do to feel more in control of your life? These are all very important questions. And I think we're going to move on to the final topic in our sociological examination of fear, which is a little bit of a deeper dive into media's role in the fear of pandemics. So move on to Holman and colleagues' research on news reporting. Holman and colleagues have been conducting research on the effects of news reporting following a variety of different disasters. And so the graph that you're seeing, or the chart that you're seeing here, is related to the Boston Marathon bombing and how much stress, how many stress symptoms people were experiencing given their media exposure directly following the Boston Marathon bombing. Interestingly, as this graph shows, the more media their respondents consumed, the more stress they experienced. And they also found that people who consumed more sensationalistic news experienced acute stress and had poorer health for up to 3 years later. So this was a long-term effect. And there was another study, this current study on the Boston Marathon bombing. This was a nationally representative sample, and they also drew representative subsamples from both Boston, where the marathon bombing was, and New York, because of they experienced the 9/11 bombings. And then Holman and colleagues were looking at the effects of media exposure in these groups and in the population as a whole. And what they found is that repeated exposure to media about Boston Marathon bombings, either on TV, radio, print, online, was associated with higher levels of acute stress than actually being at or near the bombings. So people that were far away and not actually at risk of having maybe been at the marathon and experienced the bombings were actually, if they repeatedly watched media about the bombings, they were more likely to be stressed out. So Holman and colleagues conclude that media coverage following collective traumas can diffuse acute stress widely beyond directly affected communities. Another topic in terms of media and fear is an examination of what narratives the media chooses in their coverage, and also the effects of that framing. So a definition of media framing is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text, in a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, or treatment recommendation. So there's an interesting study on media framing in the UK following and during the Ebola crisis in 2014, 2015. And this is Pieri's research. They traced the evolution of how the UK news media framed the risk of contagion and argued that it influenced policy responses because of media framing. Peary observed an outbreak narrative, which is one that argues that the pandemic originates outside the West and includes fear that the contagion may spread to the West. So it's an outsider narrative. And also, Peary recognized the framing of this Ebola epidemic as a global security concern. And then in concert with this framing, the policy focus became one of controlling the source of the virus and eradicating the disease to prevent its spread. And it led to a fortress mentality and screenings and border closings that may not have been effective, but were influenced by the fear of rapid contagious spread. And we see some of this in the COVID-19 pandemic, when airport screening may have diverted resources from controlling the spread of the virus that was already in the US. So Peary concludes that the security framing contributes to panic narratives and the desire to find somebody to blame, which can lead to unfounded border entrance screenings and xenophobia in general. And Peary concludes that mainstream media can reproduce certain unhelpful themes, which can become problematic as they may reduce the scope for open public debate around best responses to infectious diseases. So this is another thing that you can think about as you're thinking about historically how we've responded at this point to the COVID-19 pandemic, and also currently in the future. Look at how the news media is framing the COVID-19 pandemic. What are the narratives that you see? Did we see an outbreak narrative? Is this framed as a security crisis? And could this be potentially informing public health responses and policy responses? And also, just in general, what kinds of policy and government responses could be seen possible if a pandemic was only framed as a humanitarian and health emergency and not a security concern? It's an interesting thing to consider, and one that maybe is pretty difficult to do because we're so used to thinking in many ways about an outbreak mentality and global security crisis at this point. But what if we just considered it as a humanitarian and health emergency? What then? So if we're thinking about kind of wrapping up a little bit in terms of the sociology of fear, at least, I would argue that what we fear and how much we fear are influenced not only by the scary threats that we face, but also by larger scale factors, such as how our culture makes meaning of fear and adversity and vulnerability. What are the systems of privilege and oppression that are operating in our country? How do our media frame what's going on, and how much media do we consume and of what kind? And then also the behavior of those with whom we interact. All of these things can influence our own individual experiences of fear during this pandemic. And I'm hoping that you, at this point, will consider, how do you think these factors have affected your own experience of the current pandemic? Do you see anything here that rings true for you? And at this point, I'm hoping that you'll pause the video and take a quick break, because we're going to be moving now, transitioning from fear to resilience. It's a perfect time for you to take a little stretch break. All right, I hope you had a good break. Welcome back. We are going to be continuing on by looking at some of the sociological understandings of resilience. A lot of my current teaching and professional work has been on well-being recently, and on efforts to promote flourishing at Evergreen and in my larger community in Tacoma, Washington. In this section, I'm going to show you a nested model of well-being that we're using in advising in inclusive excellence and student success at Evergreen, and consider how we can enhance our community and individual well-being using a variety of techniques. So this is a conglomeration of several different models of well-being that are out there. Sometimes when people think about well-being or resilience, they just think about individual experiences, and that can be recognized on the image that's on the far right of your screen, which includes dimensions of well-being, 8 different dimensions of well-being. So we can think about well-being physically, emotionally, environmentally, financially, occupationally, intellectually, spiritually, socially, and other dimensions as well. But if you were to look at what I think is a more sociologically relevant model, it incorporates not just all of those individual dimensions of well-being, but recognizes that individuals exist within cultures and within families and in work sites and in communities, and have a variety of different cultural identities that influence their opportunities and their choices, and that we all exist within communities, built environments, natural environments, in a global ecosystem, and that all of these things need to be considered when we're thinking about well-being and promoting well-being for all of us. So one of my favorite authors of community psychology, Prilatensky, writes about well-being as a state of positivity and balance in these different dimensions as we satisfy our needs in those areas, and recognizes that it's influenced by and experienced on lots of different levels, those ecological levels of relationships, organizations, communities, the natural environment, and is enhanced by the promotion of justice on all of those different levels. So resilience is defined then as adapting well and growing in the face of crisis. And we can look at resilience similarly to fear by examining resilience and well-being in micro contexts and in more macro contexts as well. So in thinking about community and resilience, it's important to recognize that flourishing is a shared quality that is built in community, and many of the wonderful presentations in Pandemic Academy have already talked about this and given many examples. So for example, Gordon Nemhart's presentation on community resilience and mutual aid gave many examples of organizations that collectively support the survival and liberation of people of color and women, for example. And Zoltan Grossman's presentation on the resilience doctrine and disaster cooperativism provided examples of how disasters bring people together for communal recovery. And one of Zoltan's sources stressed the importance of kindness, generosity, and courage more than survival skills following a disaster. And I wanted to highlight that because something that we're seeing right now is really relevant. And that is that we can consider the basic goodness of people around us by thinking about social distancing as an act of altruism. It's done by us, but for the good of others, more than for the good of ourselves. So this is an example for me of disaster cooperativism. There's another resource that talks about healing and resilience as being shaped by and anchored in shared identities. Our identities of race and gender, sexuality, for example, and all of these identities provide meaning and belonging that help us to heal and be resilient in difficult times. Another resource that I asked you to consider reading for today's presentation was by Glass and colleagues called Bioterrorism in the People. And I think that this article shows us an important piece of community resilience in a crisis, which is the importance of assuming that the public is courageous, capable, and resourceful. And the authors give us many suggestions about how to integrate the public into a crisis response. They begin by noting that the public may not be seen as a potential resource in disasters because professionals or officials might assume that they're irrational or uncooperative or they're going to panic. So the public is not used well as a resource in disaster response. But actually, there are lots of different examples of volunteers individually and in organized groups helping for search and rescue and relief. For example, after the 9/11 attack, well before professional operations were in place. So the authors argue that in a catastrophic epidemic, the general response of the public is one of resourcefulness, civility, and mutual aid, not one of panic or uncooperativeness. And these guidelines that they offer can help us evaluate how well our officials and our communities are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope that as I review their guidelines, you'll consider how we're doing and also what we're learning about what we need to change for the future in order to better respond. So in bioterrorism and the people, the authors provide these crisis response guidelines. And the first one is that officials should recognize that panic is rare and preventable. So in large epidemics of unknown diseases, such as in the 14th century European plague, social disruption is most common early in the outbreak as people are trying to avoid exposure, and knowledge is rare. But as communities develop routines and strategies for coping, this social disruption tends to diminish. And that is why effective communication is really important early in an epidemic, because it increases the public's sense of control, for example. So in that sense, thinking about that, was panic buying of TP and masks unreasonable? Or was it evidence of the public's resourcefulness because we did not have advice from professionals that was clear, and we had a lack of knowledge. So was it a reasonable response? The second element of their guidelines is to enlist the general public as a capable partner. This involves using the social ties and resources and leadership that already exists in communities, within organizations and communities, to create a coordinated response. And this could be very important, especially if medical needs exceed the available resources. In this case, public responders are going to be important. So we could engage people in a common and constructive mission by helping to distribute food and supplies, for example, helping to monitor the outbreak. The third element of the guidelines is to think beyond the hospital for mass casualty care. Hospitals might lack the capacity to cope with a massive and unexpected patient load and may be forced to actually ration supplies or turn patients away. So home-based patient care and the activities of neighbors and community groups to facilitate treatment might be necessary. It's the case that, for example, in the Spanish influenza outbreak in 1918, the majority of victims were cared for at home by family, neighbors, Red Cross volunteers, visiting nurses, and hospital social workers. Maybe you've seen some of this happening in the current epidemic, and maybe you have ideas about how we can do more. The authors also argue that it's important to provide information and culturally relevant information during disaster times. That leaders in the media need to release accurate, multilingual information to reduce the fear and hopelessness, and that government officials and health experts need to communicate effectively with each other and with citizens through local spokespeople and regular press conferences, and that public health officials need to offer full disclosure about the limits of their knowledge and resources so that they can remain credible and reduce the likelihood that people are going to turn to other sources for information, potentially relying on misinformation. And finally, the authors argue that we need to assume the public is not going to take the pill if it doesn't trust the doctor. People need to have confidence in their public health professionals and government leaders, and to be able to participate in ethically challenged decision-making or ethically challenging decision-making if crisis response measures are going to be able to succeed. If this is, and this is especially going to be true if they require large-scale containment and decisions about the allocations of scarce resources, like how you're going to be able to decide who gets the screening or respirators or eventually vaccines. So it's really important that we have citizens advisory panels to help include communities in what should be transparent decision-making. So how are we doing in terms of our response to the pandemic? What are we doing well in terms of these guidelines offered, and what are we learning about what we should be doing differently? And also, how aware are you of your roles and responsibilities as a member of community during this pandemic? Of course, we need to talk about the media a little bit and what we might be able to learn about resilience from research on the media. So think about this thing called solutions journalism. I'm wondering whether you have noticed this in media coverage and whether you think it's effective. In McIntyre's research, McIntyre found that in news stories about social problems, when the news stories discussed effective solutions, readers they felt less negative and also more favorable towards the solutions to the problem. So solutions journalism made people feel better, but didn't inspire people to actually act. So one question that you might consider is, well, how can we produce news stories that actually are going to create action in the viewers? In terms of media, the media that you consume, regardless of whether it's news media, social media, balance the information that you need with the anxiety that it can cause. So get your news from reputable sources and use social media to connect and form volunteer networks. Yeah. And then also, if you're interested in taking a look at movies about contagion and pandemic, it's interesting the number of films that are actually about zombies, and that's something that's that we need to look into. But also we can watch for examples in feature films of resilience and also resistance. So there's an article in the reading list called Social Responses to Epidemics Depicted by Cinema, which is really interesting. It shows examples of resistance in film that actually approximate the responses that happened in previous epidemics. So for example, why did people not isolate? Why did they fail to comply with mass isolation attempts? Where was there distrust from outside authorities? Where did people wish to maintain customary practices in terms of treating their dead instead of doing what outsiders told them they needed to do? And you can observe for yourself in your own viewing, where do you see resistance? And why do you think that resistance is there? Are these reactions due to power hierarchies, or a desire to maintain community or cultural practices? And where do you land on that? What is acceptable and what is not during a pandemic? So let's move now to individual resilience, toward individual resilience. Again, you can never really separate an individual from their community. But it's interesting to think about self-care as defiance, as resourceful defiance. The culture of self-care has been criticized as an isolating concept that asks people to solve their own problems rather than to collectively change the systems that are actually causing the harm in the first place. But we can also learn from people of color and queer communities that self-care can be a gesture of defiance, to a way of insisting that you matter and that you're worthy of care. And as African-American and lesbian writer Audre Lorde says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So with that acknowledgement, let's look at some practices that have been shown to promote individual well-being. A lot of the research on the psychology of resilience reveals that there are qualities of resilient people that we can all cultivate. And I am encouraging you to take a look at the Greater Good Science Center's guides to well-being and keys to well-being. They provide a lot of different and research that you can read to deal with any kind of resilience that you wish to develop. So even if the strategies that I'm about to show you bring, can take a look at the Greater Good Center's guides to see what might work well for you. I'm going to be looking at 3 strategies that I find particularly, which are meaning making, finding common ground, and zooming out. We're going to be starting Green and colleagues' work on the Holocaust survivorship model. It seems fitting to start with research on people who have survived terrible atrocities to learn how they've thrived after these experiences. And so Green and colleagues recruited 133 Holocaust survivors from 9 different US cities, and they interviewed them for this study. They had a particular view on resilience that focused, as resilience does, on strengths and coping instead of on grief and loss, and made the assumption that we have natural healing capacities that allow us to recover from adverse events. And based on the experiences of Holocaust survivors, the authors argue that resilience involves a variety of things, including finding a sense of safety and recognized routines, obtaining useful information and resources, resolving stressors, reestablishing a sense of control, self-mastery, or the sense that there are choices to be made, no matter how small, seeking and providing mutually supportive relationships, maintaining positive emotions and creativity, learning an appreciation of newfound strengths or an affirmation of life, and identifying meaning in an event that may be related to spirituality. And in their model, meaning making is at the core. So we need to look a little bit more at meaning making. And one person that has written quite a bit about this is Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, who writes about coping through finding meaning and this idea of tragic optimism, which is the ability to maintain hope and find meaning in life despite its inescapable pain and loss and suffering. Frankl writes, "I speak of a tragic optimism, that is, an optimism in the face of tragedy and in view of the human potential, which at its best always allows for turning suffering into a human achievement and accomplishment, deriving from guilt the opportunity to change oneself for the better, and deriving from life's transitoriness an incentive to take responsible action." So where can you find meaning and tragic optimism in your experiences right now? And finally, research shows that we can cultivate positive emotions by finding meaning. Fredrickson and colleagues have done quite a bit of research on positive emotions and resilience. And in this current study, they researched a sample of college students before and after the September 11th bombings, and wanted to know, they looked at the qualities of resilient people. And what was interesting is that everybody in their sample reported distress and comparable symptoms after the attack, but some were less likely to become depressed. And these resilient students were resilient because they were able to find good in the situation. And as a result, they experienced more positive emotions like gratitude for personal safety and the health of their loved ones, interest in learning about the unfolding situation, and love and appreciation for their friends and family. So Fredrickson and colleagues conclude that finding positive meaning may be the most powerful leverage point for cultivating positive emotions during times of crisis. And I hope you will take time then to really consider questions like what makes your life meaningful in these challenging times? And really, what is the situation helping you to learn about yourself, what you value, what your goals are, for example? Another strategy that's shown to promote flourishing during crises is finding common ground. It's true that our individual experiences of this pandemic are conditioned by social and cultural and economic structures that create inequalities. And also, this truth can be an opportunity for connection with others who share our experiences. And then, if you read at all any of the Dalai Lama's work, for example, you'll find that he argues that there is common humanity in our desire to survive, to avoid suffering, and to make sense of uncertainty. One of my favorite practices is something called mindful self-compassion. And this includes being aware of my feelings and thoughts and bodily sensations non-judgmentally, and then recognizing that I'm not alone in this experience. And there's a great deal of research from Neff and Germer and others on how mindful self-compassion can be a really important tool in promoting resilience and flourishing. Because then it gives you greater emotional and mental balance that you can use to decide how to, what your next steps should be. A final resilience technique is about perspective taking, and it's called zooming out. When you find yourself feeling fearful or upset, you might try to telescope out in time or place to consider the larger contexts of life. So for example, the Holocaust survivors in Green's previous research offers some real lessons for us. A couple of meaningful quotes that I found were from Holocaust survivors were that you can go through a lot in life and come out as a decent human being. Life is very meaningful. It's worthwhile to struggle. And also remember that what today is a great big mountain, tomorrow is a small hill. When I zoom out, I like to look at the sky and remind myself of the image of Earth taken by the Voyager 1 space probe from about 3.7 billion miles away. And that's what this image is. And as a result of this image, Carl Sagan wrote a lovely, I don't know, was it a poem? Whatever it is, it's a long, this is an excerpt from The Pale Blue Dot by Carl Sagan, who wrote, "Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. So as we move towards the end of this presentation, we can acknowledge that these uncertain times do give rise to real concerns and intense emotions, including the concern of losing life and health, loved ones, homes, jobs, civil liberties, and freedom. It's important to develop a broader understanding of why we fear without diminishing the significance of our individual concerns and feelings. Oops. So to understand how our private troubles in this pandemic are public issues, we can consider how social and cultural influences are like the water that a fish swims in. You usually don't even know that it's there. But if the fish is unwell, yeah, you treat the fish, but you also change the water. So part of those changes involve recognizing the power and resources in our own communities and in ourselves, and choosing to use them to foster our flourishing and our resilience in the pandemic. So our guiding question has been, how do social forces influence our experiences and perceptions of the COVID-19 pandemic, both in terms of fear and resilience? And this leads us to some opportunities for reflection and social observation, which is always fun as a sociologist. So I have some invitations for you to go out into the world and have a look at what we've been studying in your own lives. For example, observe your community, the media that you watch, your friends and family, and see if you can find data that both supports and diverges from the information that I've presented. So ask questions like, what is the framing of the media you consume? How do you feel when you watch the news and social media? What do you notice in the Pew data that of course you're going to go and check out about who is most fearful of the COVID-19 pandemic? How are your neighbors supporting each other, and when could you and others benefit from mindful self-compassion? You can also think for yourself and write and discuss with your friends and colleagues and classmates and family questions like, what would our current experiences be like if we swam in a cultural water that assumed our strength and capability? And how can we change that water? How can we critically consume media to benefit from accurate information and social connection without increasing fear? And what media would you create to help that along? How can we utilize our skills, knowledge, and resources to support each other, empower through coordination? And what can you contribute? And in what ways can we reframe our experiences to find meaning in our challenges? What are you learning about yourself and your life? I'll leave you with an inspirational quote from Indian civil rights activist and lawyer Mahatma Gandhi, who wrote, "Your struggles develop your strengths. When you go through hardships and decide not to surrender, that is strength." So my final slides are a list of resources and recommended readings. If you're interested in learning more about today's topics, I encourage you to follow up with these sources and also learn from careful observation of our current situation. And then ask yourself, how can I apply what I've learned today to improve my own and other people's experiences? I thank you all for your attention and also for your efforts to help yourself and others as we're weathering this pandemic together.